Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our iTOOsday. I'm going to give it about a minute or two just to let everyone settle in and get gathering. Just before we also start, our QR code is in the chat box, so will be sent in the chat box and the Q&A section. So if you please don't mind just scanning that to register online. Good morning, Yvonne. Hope you're keeping well. I am sure everyone is excited for our very short week with a fake Friday. I know I am. We have an extremely jam-packed, informative-filled morning, so I'm not going to take too much time. I want to get started as soon as possible. Before we do, if anyone does have any questions throughout the session, could I please kindly ask that you make use of our chat box, our Q&A section. We will get to you as we are going through the session in the chat box, or alternatively, we will get to you after the session or off platform. Cool. So without further ado, we hear about it, we read about it. It is a topic that is great for news ratings. It can be very terrible for peace of mind, and it's not fun to live through. I'm sure there's many things that's going through everyone's mind, but right now what I am referring to is product recalls in South Africa. They are no longer rare or isolated events. In fact, they're actually becoming a regular feature of our regulatory landscape. From contaminated consumables to mislabeled medical devices, the stakes are rising, and so is the scrutiny. Businesses are being called to account a lot faster, louder, and the financial impacts are also a lot greater. So today's conversation is actually going to revolve around risk, regulation, and readiness. We are extremely honored to be joined by someone who has seen it all from the inside. Jean Nordia, Director at Independent Claims, a seasoned loss adjuster, a casualty insurance veteran with over 20 years of experience. He's investigated everything from the listeriosis outbreak, the collapse of the Mobeni Reservoir, to fraud losses in Nigeria and cybercrime in Mauritius. Jean brings a sharp insight, real-world grit, and just enough war stories to keep us on our toes. So without further ado, over to you, Jean. Thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you, iTOO, for this opportunity to talk about this very serious situation that we're facing not only in South Africa but worldwide, despite all the heavy regulation that we've seen of late. But yes, we've got as you've mentioned, a jam-packed program. So without further ado, I'm also going to get going as quickly as possible. Perhaps just an indication of the agenda for the morning, the welcoming and opening remarks we've just attended to. We'll then look at briefly a search in recalls, trends and cases studies, the regulatory landscape, who's driving oversight in South Africa. Very important, I think, for our discussion this morning, broker responsibilities, the requirement to educate and equip your clients to deal with the reality of recalls that may be necessary within the manufacturing, retail and distribution arenas, insurance solutions that are out there, and in particular provided by the iTOO underwriting team. We'll then also open the floor to some questions and answers. All right, so let's have a look at product liability in particular. For those of you that attended my previous discussion on this platform, the main takeaway, of course, insofar as cover provided by products liability is concerned, is that it intends to provide indemnity for injury or damage caused by the nature or attributable to the nature or condition of any product. Now, the difference, of course, insofar as the recall extension to a liability policy is, of course, the issue of who addresses the costs that one would typically incur when it has been established that injury or damage resulted from a product manufactured, supplied, and distributed by an insured. And the intention of our talk today is to look at this aspect of the liability policy in particular. So let's have a look at some case studies during 2025, which has been an extremely busy year for product recall insurers in South Africa. But of course, as you know, everything eventually ends up with reinsurers out there. So the exposure has been extensive during the past couple of months. I'll focus perhaps on a couple of examples from the foodstuff and fast-moving consumer goods, then motor vehicles, and also touch on medical devices. A couple of examples that we've had the past year. Shoprite Checkers had, through a supplier heartland, was forced to recall a number of their products as a result of inaccurate nutritional values that were displayed on the exterior packaging. Now, you may ask the question, first and foremost, but hang on, why would a recall for the inaccurate nutritional values be of such importance? Now, the answer to that is obviously recent legislation that forces a manufacturer and a retailer to recall any products that contain any reference to an incorrectly labeled product. So if we have a label, and I'm sure you've seen them on the back of product packaging, displaying, for instance, something as elementary as the kilojoule values or energy values within a product. Now, if there is a misstatement in the nutritional value, or alternatively, and I've dealt with a case like that historically, where the front and back packaging actually vary, or there's a discrepancy between the nutritional values displayed, that is a justification for the authorities to instruct the retailer and ultimately the manufacturer to actually recall a product. A scary thought, as it impact on the quality contained within the defective packaging. We've also had Cape and Spice, where, as you'll see, these grinders on your screen, they started fracturing prematurely as a result of a defect contained in the grinding mechanism, and you would typically find remnants of the grinder embedded in the product, and of course that posed a health hazard to consumers, and these grinders had to be recalled from the market. We also seen a recall of a Tiger brand called Benny, basically flavored stock cubes containing inaccurate nutritional values once again. All right, looking at something for young parents, Fisher Price had to recall their 3-in-1 Snugger Puppy Activity Center, in that the encircled part actually dislodges as a result of continuous abuse, I guess, by the little critter that you place inside of this Fisher Price product, and it was thought that it poses a choking hazard to infants, and of course this product had to be recalled from throughout the retail sales floors, from parents that already acquired this product at a huge cost to Fisher Price. Another interesting recall instruction issued by the authorities this year was in fact a e-bike, the Santa Cruz Heckler 9C. The issue here was that it poses a fire hazard, in that during charging the battery overheats and it was thought that it would pose a hazard because the charging may take a couple of hours when the occupants of the dwelling would typically be asleep or not at home, and you would have your dwelling catch alight. I've actually enclosed the advert of this e-bike, and as you would see, not cheap at approximately 200,000 Rand for this bicycle. Then something that affects all of us, motor vehicles. If you've been the proud purchaser of a BMW, Lexus, Kia, Jaguar, Toyota, VW, Mercedes-Benz or Citroen vehicle between 23 and 2025, you may have received a notice from your dealer the past 3 years insofar as a number of recalls that were necessary to attend to a number of issues identified within these vehicles. These issues, of course, vary in severity from a component that would dislodge, that wouldn't be safety critical, to airbags that would literally explode and cause serious neck and spine injuries to passengers. So if your client is a manufacturer or distributor of vehicles, it would have been an extremely busy time this year. Then something that is also quite interesting and potentially very hazardous to one's health. The Boston Scientific Group had to recall a number of their products during the course of 2025, including a wall stent monorail endoprosthesis, as well as a Fairfaway over-the-wire pulsed field ablation catheter. In both instances, as these names suggest, it would be items that are inserted in very sensitive areas, and the indication is that there's either parts that dislodge during these procedures or the specifications were incorrect in the case of the wall stent product, creating potential injury to artery walls. So I think something that necessitated a recall to take place. All right, I've then also, and perhaps we'll just briefly touch on these case studies during the past 5 years. I'm sure you'll recall a couple of these. In 2024, we had aflatoxin issues with peanut butter requiring an immediate recall due to the toxicity levels of these aflatoxins in peanut butter. We also had the Purity baby powder recall, and also some hummus that contained nutritional values that were incorrect, requiring recall. In 2023, we had the Gizu power bank. I'm sure you'll recall this one. It was actually a very good year for recall insurers, in that there weren't any large or nationwide recalls per se. 2022, a very busy year again for the motor manufacturers, where amongst others Mercedes-Benz, Ford and VW Group had to recall some of their vehicles. We had Cipla requiring the recall of some of their throat sprays, and we also had a widespread recall of Cape Point light meat shredded tuna. Just to touch on the tuna can recall, the issue was not the actual content of the can, but rather the integrity of the actual weld of the can containing the tuna, where it was found that the penetration during the welding process was not on spec, and that resulted in a problem with the integrity of the weld during the course of its expected lifespan, necessitating a widespread recall. During 2021, we had another Tiger Brands product recall. You may have recalled the issue with their mixed vegetables products. Again, a recall of cans. The indication in that instance was that the product again was found to be of their regular high quality, but that the cans had an inherent defect necessitating a recall. Motor manufacturers that announced some recalls of their product included Ford and Citroën. So from a trend perspective, you will note that vehicles are at the top of the list, and for good reason. I think we all make use of vehicles, or the majority of us are reliant on the safety provided by vehicles, and they regularly feature in these recall announcements for obvious reason. All right, then stepping onto the regulatory landscape. It is not the intention of the talk this morning to give you a detailed insight as to what the process entails. Time, unfortunately, does not permit a discussion of this nature. Perhaps just a couple of pointers. If you have been party to any recall in your dealings with your clients, I'm sure the NCC, or National Consumer Commission, would feature during these discussions. The NCC is a body that would be typically responsible for issuing notices where it comes to their attention that a potentially unsafe product has entered the market. They also deal, of course, with voluntary recalls when communicated to the NCC by retailers or manufacturers. Insofar as the process is concerned, a notice will be issued, I beg your pardon, by the NCC to the relevant manufacturer and potentially also retailers, in terms whereof the manufacturing of the relevant product is seized, as well as the distribution of this product, and they also require the development and submission of a recall strategy. It's a point that we'll get to a little bit later, and for the moment, safe to say that they would also typically want included public notification and also a plan dealing with the facilitation of returns, the safe storage of defective product, and the eventual disposal of these defective products. I think we'll comment on these items a little bit later. Very importantly, the progress made with this whole program and system to recall products need to be reported on regularly to the Commission, and they would then decide whether or not to intervene if the recall process is lagging or, in their opinion, ineffective, especially with reference potentially to the listeriosis matter a couple of years ago. There was that ongoing reporting of cases of listeriosis by consumers, which may have motivated additional steps being taken to expedite the recall process. And tongue-in-cheek, in my case, led to a lot of sleepless nights as a result. Then we have the South African Health Products Regulatory Authority, something that is perhaps less known to the larger public. Basically, an entity of the National Department of Health to ensure the health and well-being of humans and animals. They have become increasingly active in the last couple of years, monitoring products placed on our shelves, and it's not just locally produced products, but also imports. One of the main objectives, of course, of this entity is to ensure the effectiveness of medication, the prevention of the retail of products that had expired, and of course also the side effects. You would have noted that the use or the testing of products on animals has been a huge focus in the last couple of years, and that practice has virtually stopped as a result of the interaction of entities such as this one. All right, then Department of Trade, Industry and Competition, the DTIC, they play an extremely important role in developing the South African economy, and in doing so, partnering with other departments such as the Department of Agriculture in an attempt to ensure that we don't have these widespread recall actions that may be detrimental to not only the economy at large, but also the financial ruin of companies. So in practice, I have found in the last couple of years that when South African companies intend exporting their products abroad, there are very strict regulations issued insofar as the compliance by South African manufacturers or producers to comply with the importing companies' regulations. In other words, if we produce a very good red wine in South Africa for export to, for instance, Asia, and the Asian markets require, for example, a volatile acidity or a residual sugar level of X and Y, the departments referred to would actually require samples to be tested prior to these products actually leaving South Africa to determine compliance. So you need to submit your product for analysis, and they would look at the results, and if these products are either borderline or fail to comply with the importing countries' regulations or specifications, they will actually prevent the export of these products to these countries. So a very important step taken by the DTIC to prevent this financial ruin to a company locally. As you can imagine, the recall of product exported are enormous, and unless the appropriate insurance cover has in fact been effected, can cause the financial ruin that I referred to a bit earlier. Then something I'm sure all of you are very familiar with, the Consumer Protection Act, and of course the provisions contained therein. Once again, not the intention of our discussion today to deal with each and every regulation or provision in the Consumer Protection Act that would apply to recalls, but in essence, the intention of the Consumer Protection Act is to ensure the safety of the consumer at large. And as part of its function, it prohibits the sale and distribution of products that are unsafe or create false advertising. Alternatively, for certain terms and conditions imposed by the retailers to make it very difficult for consumers to claim redress in the event that a product creates injury or damage as a result of the defective nature of a product. So perhaps in the next session, one can deal with the inner workings of the Consumer Protection Act in a little bit more detail if there is a demand for such discussion. Then stepping on to the next topic, the responsibilities of a broker. And this is a topic that I think is extremely important in the current context of insurance. You would typically have a client that seeks your guidance insofar as effecting cover for the nature of their particular business is concerned. I see it quite often that when I review a policy schedule, that the insured has only opted to effect products liability cover. As I mentioned earlier in our discussion, the intention of the products liability section of a policy is to provide cover for injury or damage that may be attributable to the nature or condition of a product. However, the potential exposure for your clients, unfortunately, does not stop there. There's also the added requirement of, in certain instances, recalling a product, and if in another session there's an interest, I'm more than happy to also then talk about the requirement of possibly product guarantee. For purposes of our discussion this morning, I decided to highlight a couple of issues that may assist you in your discussion with your client insofar as the need for product recall cover in particular. So during your financial needs analysis, I'm sure that you would typically address issues with your clients involved in manufacturing and distribution, whether the nature of their business requires the need for this bouquet of liability cover mentioned earlier. So a good starting point would be to familiarize yourself with the nature of your client's business, whether it's manufacturing or the distribution of products. It requires an in-depth evaluation of whether or not there is a need for this full bouquet, as I've mentioned. This process would typically require an in-depth study of each product, and then very importantly, a request for your client to give consideration to the associated hazards of the relevant product. As we've seen in the previous slides, the type of recalls that are necessary are quite wide. Your clients may only be involved in the retailing of foodstuff, but as we've seen, the notice can be issued on both the manufacturer and the retailer, and there is this combined responsibility of both the manufacturer and the retailer to ensure the smooth recalling and removing of potentially hazardous products from shelves. And it's also, of course, necessary to determine what hazards are relevant to the nature of this particular product. In doing so, the application of the product is extremely important. I specifically refer to these extremely complicated catheters in an earlier slide. So when your clients are involved in the manufacturing, distribution, or retailing even of medical devices, it's important to understand the application of this product. If it's inserted, for instance, in arteries to clean them, or to insert scopes in sensitive areas, I think it goes without saying that the potential for injury in the event of a product being defective is rather likely. So in a case like that, it goes without saying that a full bouquet of the products available in a liability program would be necessary. Another key consideration, of course, is the geographical distribution area. Is the product intended for local consumption only, or would the products also be exported, for instance? And then one needs to look at exports to, for instance, the USA and Canada, as you know, a certain additional underwriting criteria would apply in these particular jurisdictions. There's also different requirements, as I've mentioned earlier, by different countries. Some countries may be a lot stricter in applying their product specifications to imported goods. We know that the EU has really stepped up their game insofar as products emanating from the African continent is concerned. So it is important to understand where these products are actually headed. And then, very importantly, determination of the severity and the probability of risk and harm. Now, this is a topic that can keep one busy for an entire week. How does one determine the severity and probability of risk and harm? Well, perhaps by virtue, apologies, I got ahead of myself there. Looking at a couple of definitions, harm can be considered to be the adverse impact on an individual, the environment, or property. The severity of harm is, of course, the measured effect of harm. The probability of harm is the likelihood of the identified hazard causing harm, and risk determination as the process to determine the possible level of harm. You can do yourself a favor and perhaps download a manual called PRISM, P-R-I-S-M. This is the determination of severity and probability of risk and harm manual that's issued by the EU. Makes for very interesting reading, and I can make this available if there is a requirement from the floor for insight. It will definitely help your clients in determining the severity and probability of risk and harm. It gives a very good insight into how this is undertaken, and the relevance, of course, of all of these terms is to get to a point where you decide, in conjunction with discussions with your client, whether or not the probability of injury or damage to property is of such that this risk can be basically borne by your client, or alternatively to transfer the risk of claims emanating from injury or damage caused to a risk carrier such as iTOO. In doing so, one would obviously need to look at a couple of factors, and I've tried to enhance the process by referring to, for instance, looking at, from a probability perspective, whether the client has in fact have in place a very robust quality assurance program, in terms whereof there is constant recording of production results, the quality of products, the nature of any defects, or the extent of any defects discovered during this quality assurance process, and also whether there's a robust reporting process in place, which would give us a very good indication of the extent to which there is this possible way of mitigating the risk of a product in a defective nature entering the commercial arena. So if your client has a very good quality assurance program in place, that may help in, first and foremost, approaching an insurer for preferential rates, as opposed to, of course, a company that has no quality assurance in place and have this cowboy approach to manufacturing by virtue of selling whatever they can produce without any QC process in place. Then, of course, a risk management policy as a second factor that one can take into consideration to determine to what extent the company needs to effect insurance cover, and of course the limit that one would typically require. And during the risk management exercise, one would typically look at to what extent your client has a full database of its products, what these products relate to, their formulations, whether there's traceability, for instance, once it leaves their premises, looking at their distribution network, whether or not it is possible to keep some sort of control of where the product is in fact distributed to, looking at responsibility ultimately, a very important point. If the customers of your client accept no responsibility for any product that is placed on their shelves, and that the responsibility for recalls, injury, or damage caused falls 100% back onto your client, then of course it is a factor to take into consideration. So during the responsibility check, one would typically want access to agreements concluded with customers to determine the potential extent of liability. Then a very important point, also a requirement of the Consumer Commission in the event of a recall. Is there a plan in place in the event of a potential recall of products? Such a plan would typically include the appointment of a recall team, very similar to a response team in the event of a fire. So a similar exercise needs to be undertaken. So you typically want to involve your quality control manager, you need your production manager or factory manager, you need your distribution manager, and the like. And this team would typically need to convene at very short notice. They need to have team members resorting under each of these main members, and then also the plan how to retrieve product that has actually left the warehouse or storerooms of the client into the commercial space. Then the next point would be communication channels. Who is responsible for communicating what to whom? You possibly then want to rope in your sales manager to have a discussion with customers, and you also then obviously need to report this potential recall to the authorities and keep them updated as to developments. And then very importantly as well, record keeping. The Consumer Commission is extremely finicky about record keeping. You need to be able to demonstrate to the Consumer Commission that you have recalled all of your products that are found to have been defective. Alternatively, you would need to be able to determine where these products have been distributed to, so that plans can be put in place to retrieve the products. As an example, if it has been exported, what steps are being undertaken to liaise with the authorities in these foreign jurisdictions insofar as the recall of exported products are concerned. And again, the keeping of records of discussions, of instructions to recall, and the successes would be very important. Then in the last block, the retrieval, storage, disposal, and reporting to stakeholders need to be documented insofar as the plan of action is concerned. And once all of these issues have been addressed, one would have a good sense of how robust the process would typically be in the event of a theoretical recall of an effective product. And This information presented to a liability underwriter will make their lives a lot easier to understand their potential exposure as well in the event of a recall. Looking at insurance solutions, I've left this for last. This is where hopefully we have now terminology that is more understandable. It's something that we deal with every day, and I have referred to typically to the wording of the I2 policy insofar as cover provided under the recall extension is concerned. So if you will forgive me, I will just read out the insuring clause, and it states as follows. Notwithstanding anything to the contrary contained in section 2, product liability in brackets, specific exclusion D, we will indemnify you in accordance with the indemnity agreement against loss in excess of the deductible, but not exceeding the indemnity limit stated in the schedule, resulting from an insured event that takes place during the period of insurance. You would have seen some of these terms are highlighted, and that is actually the original emphasis. The term insured event means any product recall resulting directly from a defect. Again, the original emphasis. The term product recall is very interesting. That means the withdrawal or recall of the insured's product from the stream of commerce because of a known or suspected defect, provided that such insured product were first introduced into the stream of commerce after the inception of the period of insurance and are no longer in your physical possession. If I can perhaps just stop at this definition, it's one that I wouldn't say creates a lot of contention, but it goes without saying that it would be too late for your client to effect product recall cover after the product had already left their warehouses or storerooms and a recall notice has already been issued. That would be too late to then approach I2 for this type of cover. It's also interesting to note that there must be a known or a suspected defect. We have quite interesting discussions about the suspected defect aspect, as you can imagine, as it happens from time to time that reports are made to the Consumer Commission that, for instance, in the latest cases of the Mitchum sprays, I'm sure you would have seen that in the media, you have individuals or consumers developing quite a bad rash after using the Mitchum product. Now, the issue, of course, is that the recall or the necessity to recall these sprays are usually overtaken by the completion of an investigation into the cause of such rash developing on end users or under their armpits. So, in some instances, it's necessary to effect a recall on a suspicion, and the suspicion can usually be based on the number of consumers that report a similar onset of side effects. So I guess that would be an example of where the suspicion would kick in. All right, then there's also the requirement of the introduction of the product into the stream of commerce. So it goes without saying that if the products are not or no longer in the warehouses but distributed into the market, that would be an example of where it's been introduced into the stream of commerce. However, if you have half the products that had already left the warehouse and had been distributed, but the other half of this particular consignment sitting in the insured's storerooms or warehouses, I think there's an argument to be made by insurers that the recall will logically only apply to products that have already been distributed. I say logically because we have a couple of examples in the industry where, for instance, products had been collected by a contractor responsible for the distribution of these products, but had not yet arrived on the shelves or in the warehouses of the retailers. Then, of course, interesting discussions again arise as to whether or not these products had been introduced into the stream of commerce. All right, moving along, the definition of defect means a defect, deficiency, or hazard in the insured product that presents a significant risk of bodily injury to any person or of property damage when the insured product is utilized. Now, what makes this definition very interesting, of course, is that there needs to be the significant risk of injury or damage. We have a number of cases where producers of wine have initiated recalls where a label, for instance, was applied incorrectly, in other words, skew, or the color matrix of the label doesn't suit the winemaker's taste any longer, or for whatever reasons, let's call them insignificant reasons. So the cover would only respond in the event that your client can demonstrate that there is a significant risk of bodily injury or property damage should this product not be recalled immediately. So we have a couple of cases where, for instance, as a result of the onset of a protein instability in wine becomes discolored, or alternatively, if we have the development of what seems to be glass shards collecting at the bottom of wine or wine bottle, although protein instability is not considered to be detrimental to the health of the person ingesting the wine, the argument seen, of course, insofar as the development of these crystals at the bottom of the bottle suggests that they are in fact pieces of glass, and consumers are of course extremely wary of ingesting wine despite an indication that it is safe for use. So it makes for very interesting discussions, that I can assure you. Then, very interesting and very important, the definition of product recall costs. It means the reasonable and necessary cost incurred by you or by your distributor to withdraw or destroy the affected insured product pursuant to an insured event. In the iTOO policy, they elaborate on typical costs that they would consider in the event of a recall action, and this list is rather extensive. It also includes the cost, for instance, of reporting the recall in the media, the social posts, the cost of course, procuring the services of media consultants to assist one with these recall notices, the cost of warehousing the product, the cost of destroying, in the case of, for instance, the meat product in the listeriosis matter. Trucks were required to transport frozen product as far as Lichtenburg from City Deep, and that cost was also borne by that policy at the time, in that was the only area or the only furnaces that could accommodate the destruction of the approximately 4,000 tons of meat that was required to be recalled from the market. So my advice is to go through this list and to consider whether it is a comprehensive list. So in other words, compare apples with apples when looking at insurance policies. And that brings us to the end of this talk. There is obviously a plethora of aspects mentioned in the talk this morning that need to be unpacked, and hopefully we can do so in future sessions. I understand that there is a huge need for discussions on product guarantee as well, to understand what the difference between recall and guarantee entails. Unfortunately, time constraints today make this a topic for a different day, unfortunately. But I think that is all from my side for the moment. I hope it has been insightful. My suggestion is to have robust discussions with your clients, first and foremost, as I've mentioned, to understand their needs, to discuss with them what risk appetite they actually have, and if there is any need to transfer such risk to a risk carrier, to have a discussion with Suzette and the team, who would be more than happy to elaborate on the cover provided by the iTOO product range, and also to understand what other extensions or bolt-ons you may want to add to your product liability. Okay. Thank you very much for this opportunity, and a fantastic day further to all.
Thank you so much, John. Indeed, I'm sharing the same sentiments with everyone in the comments. That it was an extremely insightful and sharp presentation. You really have highlighted the realities of product recall in South Africa. It's clear that the risks are evolving, which is why we need to stay ready and also adapt to this. From the regulatory shifts that you mentioned, reputational stakes, today's session has really highlighted just how critical and important it is to have the right protection at hand. So thank you so much for your time, and thank you as well for going over exactly what iTOO offers with respect to that product recall cover. So I do believe that education is key to preparedness. It is very important to also note that our product recall offering at iTOO is an extension on our general liability policy. We look at each risk independently, so we would evaluate it on what the needs are for each client. So thank you for also providing insights on what would be needed from clients and what should be asked for. We always request the product recall plans and procedures, the quality control procedures that are also implemented for the clients and that is needed in place. So I really appreciate your time. I was just looking through the questions and I do see that one of our expert claims handler, Marlon, has answered a question by Nadia Kaur, which was around what would happen in the case of the tin food. Why was the concern over the welding not noticed before the product was dispatched to the public? Is that a common question that you may get?
Yes, indeed, and it's a very, very good question. So the reality is that our tin manufacturing concerns in South Africa have a very, very robust quality assurance process that they've adopted over the years, to the extent that they don't even do selective tin monitoring or quality assurance inspections. They in fact inspect the weld of every single can produced, and they also subject them to certain what they call total failure or total destruction tests in certain instances on samples. The issue creeps in with possibly a variation in the thickness of the substrate or the material that they receive. You can imagine they receive these huge big coils that need to be cut to size, etc. The reality, as I see it, is that in the majority of these cases, I would say 7 to 8 out of 10 cases, the can is robust enough to outlive the shelf life. But as we've mentioned earlier, the authorities have become extremely critical on products in South Africa. So if there's a remote possibility that the can will not be able to reach its shelf life, and it may vary from anything to a year up to 10 years in the case of certain products. If the indication is that it will only last for 5 years as opposed to the intended 10 years, they will actually call or submit this notice for a recall of the cans. So the days are gone of taking calculated risks. The Consumer Commission has taken it upon themselves to say, guys, if there is any potential risk of injury, harm or damage, we're going to pull the plug and we're going to issue a mandatory recall notice. So that should give us as consumers, a sense that our rights are being protected out there, and I've seen it in practice. So hopefully that answers your question, and I think that demonstrates the need for recall, because you may have voluntary recall actions, and then you have these instructions from the Consumer Commission that you have to comply with, whether or not you believe that it is unreasonable. And then there is no choice. You have to fulfill or comply with this instruction.
Great. Thanks so much, John. I think that definitely did answer the question. I'm just looking through and I don't see anything more, but I definitely do see a lot of people have requested the PRISM manual, which we will make sure to send out to all members who have joined this session. I also just wanted to put my details in the Q&A box. So you'll see myself, Shanice Naidu, and my email address. If anyone has any queries or concerns and would like to also just discuss this a bit more, I'm more than happy for anyone to reach out. And once again, we really do appreciate everyone's time. And I hope today's discussion has sparked some questions or concerns about your clients' exposures. And if needed, we would love to continue this conversation outside of this platform. Thank you again, Jean, for your time and for sharing your amazing insights with us today.
Only a pleasure.
Thanks, everyone. I hope everyone has a wonderful day. Thank you. Bye.